Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And this is a podcast where we talk about arts, culture, politics, and sport, and anything else we can think of. Now, today's guest, I've always wanted someone to talk about men's issues and men's rights. And I obviously saw this person being interviewed on Chris Williamson's podcast, Modern Wisdom. His name's George TheTinMen, and he's here to talk more about that today. Oh, hi, George.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, good, good, good. Now, before we get into the main issues, can we just discuss how you came to be, what this journey you went on, how you came to be, why you decided to set up this group, talking about men's issues and men's rights?
Um, I've always been quite cynical of politics. I've had a few different, I've been cynical of politics. I've always, as a creative, I work in the creative industry as a full-time job. I've always felt unrewarded in the content I was creating. I always wanted to create my own content. Um, and I've always wanted to take part in gender politics. And over sort of lockdown, where a lot of my work disappeared because obviously businesses closed, I decided I'm going to try and take this space, the men's issues space, or men and boys advocacy, or men's rights, or whatever you want to call it. And I was like, I'm going to try and rebrand these issues into a tone of voice and visual style with a creative strategy that I hope is a little bit more palatable than what it had previously been. During my own sort of research journey, prior to creating content, I had become like blown away by how many issues impacting men and boys that were going on all around me, and no one was talking about it, or they were talking about it in a way that I didn't find as effective. So I tried to bring my creative skill set to a political space that I think needed it, and I had the spare time. And now, obviously, COVID's over now, and we're back to working. So now I'm trying to juggle my full-time job and creating content and managing this community I've built that's sort of growing quite rapidly. And I like a challenge. I don't mind. I don't really care what people think of me. You have to have thick skin if you're going to talk about men and boys, because you're going to have quite a few people come after you,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But it's kind of a serendipitous thing that a lot of different itches I wanted to scratch all come together over COVID, and here I am.
So, and you're right about having a fixed team to discuss these issues. I can imagine some of the pushback that this interview will get, which is sadly typical, of course, when talking about this.
Mm.
Remember the interview I watched you, we discussed with Chris Williams, and you said, as an example of this, wasn't there a study that went up on Instagram and they cancelled or removed one of the slides that shows statistic?
Oh, yeah. Well, honestly, Instagram is an impossible black box to try and figure out. There's all sorts of stuff going on behind the scenes. I do know for a fact that there are people out there that just basically wait for my content to go up and then report it, regardless of what it says. And the way Instagram works is that there isn't like someone checking posts. It's all done by an algorithm, and if the algorithm gets a certain amount of reports, regardless of whether the thing being reported is actually against content guidelines, it will be removed. So often I have posts removed. I've had half a dozen or so during my time, but recently I had one slide taken away, which I didn't even know they could do. But I've not shared any content that contravenes Instagram's terms and conditions, but it doesn't really matter. And it's interesting because I'm not the only person in the space that has that. A lot of people speaking about men and boys have content deleted, taken down, or the whole account banned, or I'm almost always permanently shadow banned, where my content is sort of limited from my full audience. And I think I'm shadow banned currently. And it's sort of interesting because that's obviously at odds with what I'm constantly being told, where men have always had their say. It's always been about men, and I can't even share my own content freely without all the things I was mentioned. So it's definitely a hard place to talk. I hope you won't get any pushback. I don't think you will, but it's not unusual, and it's disappointing, to be honest, and it can be demoralizing. But I guess it's the way it goes, and that's what I mean. Like, that's why I feel like my work is important, because I want to, although I can't change everyone's minds, I do like to think that I can present these things in a way that is more palatable and more understandable to more people than anyone else is currently doing. So it's frustrating, but a necessary frustration, I'd say.
obviously me and you are talking about this now, and there's been a whole thing about women's spaces and
Mm.
like, but in terms of men's spaces, I was thinking about this the other day, and I can't remember who it was, but someone said mentioned about it, because of factories closed and where you had a lot of men and they would talk not just in the factory but at lunchtime. Where yes, you still have pubs, but then pubs, a lot of them have closed now, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
So in terms of discussing these issues, not just, I'm not just talking about the media, but just in general, do you think those any spaces that men used to have where they could just be with other men, do you think those spaces have got less and less and less as time's gone on?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are quite hostile to the idea of men having their own spaces for men to talk. And I don't understand why it has to be such a controversial idea. I think there's something inherently important about men talking to other men, not because they're better or worse than women, but just because there's something that only men can really understand about other men. Absolutely, the same thing applies to women, and I'm equally passionate about women having their own spaces for the exact same reasons. But yeah, no, absolutely, you mentioned some good ones. I know like the Boy Scouts is obviously a boys' space, not a men's space, but typically Boy Scouts was for boys, but now it's not. Now girls can go to the Boy Scouts, and although I sympathize with the reason why. And my sister went to Brownies, I went to Boy Scouts, and she was like doing like sewing and all that crap that she wasn't interested in. And I was like climbing trees and doing all making bow and arrows. And I do think girls should have access to those skills too. I do feel like we need to change Brownies to make it more comprehensive for more girls. But I don't believe we should be having girls in Boy Scouts because I think there's something extremely formative and important for boys having Boy Scouts, especially when they're young, they're adolescent, they're going through puberty, they don't know what's going on, and having access to other boys and I guess a male role model in the form of a scout leader is a really, really important thing. And not only is it important because boys understand boys, but I feel like as men and boys, we change how we behave when there's a woman or a girl in a room in a way that maybe we're not quite as open. We're a little bit more like trying to impress each other. We're competing more.
Yeah.
And that's not even a woman's fault, but just bringing that feminine person into a space, it changes the entire dynamic. And like I said, I'm all for reforming Brownies to make it more like the Boy Scouts, but I'm not fully supportive of girls joining the Boy Scouts, to be honest. And similar, there's a lot of space for that for men that have been like closed down or had funding removed or are forced to introduce women, and case by case basis. But overall, I think it's a bad thing that we're losing men's spaces, and especially the men's mental health crisis, especially like crime. Like young boys, if they're not going to Boy Scouts or if they're not going to youth clubs, then they're going to join gangs. They're going to join gangs. They're going to go out and start, being delinquent and engaging in perhaps criminal behavior. And youth clubs, especially, I think, are really, really important into giving a place for boys to go that is healthy and gives them a sense of family and belonging that they are otherwise just not getting. And instead, they go to find that sense of belonging elsewhere, and that's where the gangs come in, because obviously that's what gangs exploit: boys who are lonely, perhaps come from fatherless homes, boys who don't have access to these spaces, and the gangs bring them in and indoctrinate them. So it's important for all of us, for boys to have spaces and men, because it's not just a benefit to only them, but to all of us as a society.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a boxing background and
Boxing
in high
gyms.
school. Yeah, and one of the things I mention is in terms of how boxing gyms work, they give solace to. I tend to
Mm,
tell people, but especially men back in the day, they're giving solace to men who may have come from a fatherless home, and now
mm,
they could have like other boys and like a head
mm,
coach who was a father figure as well. And
mm,
I feel one of the problems is there's not that understanding of men needing their spaces, but also the different ways in which men and women behave. In the sense that if you put like a woman in a male space and
mm,
put all the best intentions, she could say, "Oh,
mm,
let's have this," whereas men are more practical and so on and so forth.
mm.
I'm just wondering, do you think that's a fundamental problem that actually we tend to see more these days? Well, consider that men and women are the same, and really they're not. They more complement each other, and that causes
Mm.
conflict.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, trying to disentangle. I mean, I think we all agree that men and women are, in general, different to one another. That's not to say there aren't women that are like men and men that are like women. Of course, they are. I'm talk about in general. Men are this way, women are that way, and it overlaps. Like I said, but the difficult thing is how much of that is biological differences or neurological differences, how much of it is cultural, sociological, sort of the influence of culture on boys and men. I mean, the boring but correct answer is both. It's both biological and culturally enforced. So it's difficult which bits are what, but I feel like we are different, and it's important to say that although we are different, doesn't mean one of us is better than the other. We're both, women and men are both equally important, but different, and we are complementary of each other. I think, yeah, like we see, like a way of seeing it is that men and women are physically different. In general,
Yeah.
we are physically different. Men are sort of taller, bigger, stronger, have higher stamina, and in the same way that we're physically different, we are psychologically different to make use of our physical differences, which explains why men are more aggressive, perhaps more assertive, more violent even. And that makes sense because that obviously marries up with their physical side. There'd be no point for a man to be physically different to a woman if he was neurologically the same. So I'm not qualified, and I don't think we even have the time to work out which parts of male behavior is biological and which parts are cultural. But it's surely both. And it shouldn't be an unpopular thing to say women and men are different, because they are, and they have different interests as well. And those different interests play themselves out in different ways. But which ones are biological, which ones are cultural, it's a very complicated conversation, and it shouldn't be unpopular to say that.
Yeah, indeed. For the record, for this conversation, I come from a single mother household. So obviously when it comes about fatherlessness and whatnot, and my mum did a job with me and the rest of my siblings as well. But I had a conversation with someone many years ago, and I was trying to explain to them who's another woman that said this is the reason why fathers are important in the household, both for men and for women actually. And one of the things I said is when you're born as a child, your blueprint as the first person you see or significant person is your father. So your father becomes your blueprint with regards to, especially for men, how you conduct yourselves towards other people, towards other women, how to be and so on and so forth. But do you think that importance of fathers has been lost? Because it seems to have been lost over the years for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yeah, there are more and more single parent households than ever, and that's typically the mother. It's very difficult to have a conversation with fatherlessness, but the facts are all there. Like a child from a fatherless home is more likely to be delinquent, more likely to drop out of school, more likely to be homeless, be addicted to drugs, more likely to attempt suicide, more likely to join a gang, more likely to be a violent criminal. That again, that's not to say that anyone from a fatherless home is going to become that thing. You're a great example, but the correlation is very, very interesting, and solving the fatherlessness crisis is a complicated matter in itself. But it's hard because people feel like you're blaming single mothers.
Yeah.
But there are far more amazing single mothers than there are poor single mothers. But Obama famously talked about it, and it is. I mean, I don't want to stereotype you, but it is a particular problem within Black families, Black communities, and again, like Black communities, and then you're looking at criminality, gang violence. Like there has to be some sort of interplay there. Personally, I think the solution to fatherlessness is giving men more choice on when or if they become parent, and then you start talking about things like reproductive rights for men and what's called voluntary parental surrender. But I mean, that's getting into the weeds a little bit. But you are right in the sense that even if we can't solve fatherlessness straight away, we can start respecting fathers more and appreciating the unique value they bring to families, just like mothers, just as essential as mothers. And it's a shame because often in the media, fathers are sort of derided or patronized or made to look inept or incapable, or basically treated as second-class parents, which they are. They are legally second-class parents, and they're not given the same rights. They're not given the same respect. They're not given same appreciation, and yet we expect them to provide the exact same responsibility as mothers. And I'm always just like, if you want fathers to be equally responsible for their child, they deserve to have equal rights to that child, and they don't. So I feel like we need to give fathers equal rights, which they don't have, if we are going to ask them to have equal responsibility. And hopefully through that conversation we can start to reduce the fatherlessness crisis and reduce all those sort of secondary outputs, impacts that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, my full-time job, I'm not going to say it's for purposes, but I've been working for the same company for 16 years. But for about 7 months before that, I was unemployed. And I remember having an interview for one particular job. It was an admin job. And I'm there in a waiting room, and there was another man there in the waiting room. And you could tell he just wanted to say something, and he just started speaking to me. And he was saying that used to be his local radio producer from London, and he was coming down to Birmingham, where I'm based. And he was saying that the reason he was doing so is because he broke up with his wife, and the wife took the kids to Birmingham, and that's why he was moving to do this job, which is a lot less money than what he was doing in London. And they called my name for the interview, and he just wanted me to stay and talk some more. He seems like a lot off his chest. Just wonder, with the family courts, I mean, how bad is it in the family courts now? Because you have men who are, with the greatest respect, almost committing suicide because they can't see their kids.
No, there's no almost about it. A large number of men complete suicide as a result of losing children, family courts, child custody, relationship breakdown. That's one of the primary causes of male suicide. And now there's been studies that have linked about 20% of suicides in the UK, of which are about 5,000 male suicides a year. 20% of those are expected to be linked to family courts, child custody, relationship breakdown, that sort of thing. So it is a big issue. And I feel like it's not surprising. If you were to ask any parent what's the most important thing in your life, I imagine 99% of them would say my child. So to lose the thing most important to you must be heartbreaking, and it's not surprising that a lot of fathers would just choose not to be here anymore if they've lost access to the thing they love the most.
Yeah,
It does make some sense. It's like quite a rational decision in many ways, in a very sad way. And one of the things I do is I encourage people not to see male suicide primarily as a mental health problem, but as a societal problem.
yeah.
And if you think about a father losing his child, I don't think it's fair to say he has a mental health problem. I'll be like, no, he has a family problem that is very real. And as I said, asking about how bad are family courts, it's a systemic problem because the family courts are systemically sexist against fathers and in favor of mothers. Like I said, if you are an unmarried father in the UK, you don't have equal rights to your child. If you're not named on a birth certificate, you don't have equal rights to your child. You don't have any rights. In fact, no rights. So the way it works in the UK is that it's called parental responsibility. That's what parental rights is actually technically called. And to have them as a father, you have to be married, you have to be named on the birth certificate. If you haven't got those things, no rights. Not the same for the mother. The mother has rights, full rights, every single circumstance. So whether she's single, married, divorced, separated, whatever, full rights to a child, and rightly so. But why are we not giving fathers the same rights as mothers? It is crazy. And the family court system is broken. It has historically been very secretive. That's slowly changing. It hasn't changed enough. And it's sort of a dirty little secret at the very center of our judicial system that no one wants to talk about because it genuinely is systemically sexist against men. And if you ever talk about systemic sexism against men, that's when the DMs start coming, and then that is when you get heckled or cancelled or whatever else, and your post gets deleted. But it doesn't stop it from being true, and it is true. And fathers deserve equal rights. Simple as that.
So why can't we just say, and I'm kind of being facetious when saying this because I kind of know the answer, but why can't we just say, you know what, men, you just got to do better. You just got to go to the gym more. You just got to put yourself in more better situations more. You just got to go there and do your job, be a man. Why can't we just say that to men?
Well, we can say that to men, and I think that is a very helpful thing. I go to the gym. I've just been to the gym today. Feel great.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate that voice in the men's space. I do feel like it's a positive voice where it's about men taking agency and ownership over their lives and being like, I'm going to fix this. I am going to go to the gym. I am going to get up early. I am going to take the dog for a walk. I am going to But although that is a very good thing, it's not a complete solution because you can go to the gym every day of the week, but you still won't have father's rights. You'll still lose your child in family courts, you just might be a little bit more jacked when that happens. But I think it's important to appreciate the importance of what you just said, but at the same time to also appreciate the limitations that not everything can be solved through, going to the gym and getting up more and, asserting yourself and being more confident. That men aren't in control of everything. And that's an important part of the conversation too.
Well, we just talked about fatherlessness and in terms of family and whatnot, but obviously the one main thing that affects men in the family is divorce as well. And admittedly, I don't have the stats for this, but it seems to be that men are getting less and less people are actually getting married. It seems to me from the side. Is that the case? And also, why are more men not getting married if that is the case?
I don't have the stats either, but I think women don't want to get married as much anymore. I mean, that's pretty well understood. I don't think anyone could disagree with that. Like in terms of 50 years ago, I feel like fewer and fewer women want to get married, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I feel like more women want to enter the workforce, more women want to sort of have careers, more women want to sort of, explore themselves in their lifetime rather than just going straight to marriage and, being a mother or a homemaker. And obviously that impacts men too. So I'd say that's probably the reason why. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know why every single thing is different, but I wish that in the same way I just described the journey women have been on, so they can move outside of being a homemaker, mother, wife. I don't think we've seen the opposing renaissance for men. Men are still contained within the box of provider, protector, figurehead. Whereas and also work. A lot of men's value comes from work, in the same way as a lot of women's value came from the family and the home. And women have found value outside of those things now, but I don't think men have. So I wish more men would not find value as much from money, success, and status, although those are important. I wish more men would find value in being a father or a friend, or having hobbies, or just enjoying themselves rather than spending their entire life dedicated to a career. So I can't answer your question, but I do think it's an important chance to talk about how men need to find more meaning for more places than just work and status and being a millionaire, which by all means be a millionaire, but that isn't the beginning and end of your value. And it's amazing to see women having gone for that journey and the benefits it's had. I just wish men would now start that journey too.
Okay. So obviously, with men's issues have more come to the forefront over the last few years. One of the things that's created is what is termed as a manosphere. These channels where they talk about men's issues in a very bombastic way to kind.
Yeah. Oh,
Why?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts on those? Obviously, there's different channels and makes a difference, but what are your overriding thoughts on those channels?
Don't like them. Don't like them. I know you mentioned Chris Williamson, Modern Wisdom. He is excellent. I love Chris. I love his brand and his work, and he, as an individual, having spoken to him personally a little bit, a wonderful man, very intelligent. I don't consider him part of the manosphere. The manosphere as a concept makes me kind of cringe. It's just like, oh my God, can't we just have a grown up conversation? Can we not just grow up a little bit? Manosphere, like what are you talking about? It's got the same sort of spooky, dramatic sense as like the patriarchy. And I'm like, patriarchy, manosphere, toxic masculinity. I'm like, are these scientific concepts? Like, do we even know what you're talking about? The manosphere started off as just basically a spooky term, which a lot of feminist spaces would use to basically vilify men who wanted to speak about men and boys outside of a feminist sort of viewpoint. And then manosphere is a way to make it sound scary, which it does. But now it's sort of been appropriated, and it's sort of been accepted by the men in the manosphere as something like, yeah, okay, that's great. That's a great collective term. But overall, I see the manosphere as free groups. I see it as the men's rights activists, the MGTOWs, meaning men going their own way, and the pickup artist / red pill guys. And like the best way of differentiating those three groups is that MRAs are trying to change the system. So they recognize there's a system, like the family court system especially, and they want to change it. MGTOWs, men going their own way, they basically want to leave the system. They've had enough. They're just a bunch of men that are like, I'm done. I don't want to date. I just want to concentrate on my life. I want to go to the gym, earn money, and they want to leave the system. And then the pickup artists want to exploit the system. So they recognize what the system is and they want to exploit it. And that's when you get like the Andrew Tates and the Fresh and Fits and Pearl and all the other idiots that are just basically exploiting men for money. And I don't think any of those three groups really have anything in common. I don't know why they're collected under the same label. If anything, they're completely different in the way I described, but they are sort of united in the sense that they are all sort of sick and tired of the feminist rhetoric that has dominated the discussion of gender politics for 100 years. So they are similar in that sense, for sure. I don't consider myself a part of any of those groups or the manosphere, but I don't think they're quite the same. I don't think it's right to call them like one homogenous group. I don't think they are a homogenous group. I mean, I've seen some pretty brutal arguments between men's rights activists and red pillars, and they don't get along, historically speaking. So I don't know why they're contained within the same group, and I'm not a fan of it, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Andrew Tate there, and I'm not a fan of his, but it was interesting. Someone who I've spoken to on social media for a number of years actually discovered Andrew Tate for the first time. I won't say who they are, but they've got a YouTube channel and they're saying they didn't like Andrew Tate and what these are the reasons why, etc. And they posted that along the lines on their Facebook group, and I sent a reply back saying I'm not a fan of Tate either. However, part of the problem is if you like we talked about with fatherlessness, if you're not going to give boys any role models, if you're going to keep saying that masculinity is toxic, it's like this guy comes along who says, "Oh well, I believe in you. You feel strong and so on and so forth. That's great." No matter how misguided he is, and no matter how misguided the people are to follow him, if that's the only person that's praising you, I kind of think, well, what do you expect? You can't ask to hate Andrew Tate and then all of a sudden, like, not provide him with anything positive about men.
Absolutely. I mean, it's famously said by that if a society ignores important social issues, then someone else will come in and talk about them instead. And that's exactly what's happened. Like, the fact of the matter is, men and boys are going through a lot of different issues, which we can talk about in detail. And they've been ignored. They've been failed. They've been failed by feminism, in my opinion. And they're disenfranchised, they're disaffected, they don't know where to look. A lot of them from fatherless homes. A lot of them don't have any male role models at school. So 80% of classrooms have a female teacher. So there's boys with no father at home, no male teacher at school. They go online, they hear all this nonsense about toxic masculinity and patriarchy and all this crap.
Yeah.
And like, totally unsurprising that they're going to go elsewhere looking for someone who will give them a role model. And it's just a shame that person they found is a massive dickhead. And Andrew Tate is a dickhead, but he is not stupid. I think he's really smart, and he's seen a gap in the market and he's exploited it. And I don't think he really cares about men and boys. I just think he wants money. And Andrew Tate is not going to be the last Andrew Tate. There'll be another one, probably maybe even worse. And people scratching their heads over who is Andrew Tate are missing the point. It's not about who is Andrew Tate. It's about why are so many people listening to him. And there are. He's probably the fastest growing influencer of all time, on TikTok especially. So you've got to ask, what is creating that appetite for a male role model? And it is the failure of the liberal left, in my opinion, and feminism, to constantly vilify boys and men, provide us no real meaningful advocacy or compassion. And they've created this vacuum, power vacuum, and Andrew Tate has stepped into it, and he's smart enough to do it, and he's made a lot of money, done a lot of damage. He's eroded the profile of men's advocacy substantially, which is why I don't like him. And he offers important lessons that are far, far beyond who is Andrew Tate, and more we should be asking, why is he here? Why is Andrew Tate? And why do so many people follow him? And you answered it yourself. Like, people are crying out, boys are crying out for such a role model, and he was the one they chose.
Well, I was going to ask you about the left and right divide, it's because it seems like the right has almost taken this on as there needs to be some role models for like for men and whatnot, and seems to have taken it on, whereas the left just being so oh, toxic masculinity, men need to do this, men to blah blah blah. Why do
Yeah,
you think it is? Why do you think there seems this left-right divide when it comes to talk about men's issues?
I think the left have pinned a lot of their influence on feminism and on women and minorities, and they've basically forgotten that 50% of the world are men, and they've brought line and sinker into these ideas like patriarchy and toxic masculinity. A lot of it's because women outvote men on all areas, especially on the left, and they're just giving voters what they want. They're just saying what they want to hear. They're just basically the new term I've heard is called politics. Politics with a TICKS, meaning tick. And I'm like, that is such a perfect term because that is what politics is. A politician will just say whatever they need to say to get you to tick their box. And that is it. They don't care about you. They couldn't give a fuck. They just want you to vote for them. And they'll just say what gets votes. And currently what gets votes is toxic masculinity, patriarchy, women, the future's female. And as we've discussed already, men and boys advocacy extremely unpopular. Not only will you not give votes, you'll lose votes. So that is why the right, the right are sort of doing it as a. I feel the right are doing a better job of men and boys advocacy, but not necessarily for authentic reasons. I feel like they're just saying they just want to get one over on the left, and obviously a lot of men and boys issues is sort of centered around family, and obviously the family unit is important to the right. So there's that overlap there, and the right is also obviously quite big on traditional masculinity and the father figure and the male role model, and again that overlaps with men and boys advocacy as well. But I would go as far to say the right are doing a far better job than the left in terms of talking about men and boys, although massively like huge shortfalls. Nowhere near good enough by any means, but they are doing better than the left, and the left are just grappling with these ideological ideas that are not based in any sort of science. They're basically political ideas. And I just feel a lot of people on the left are just simply brainwashed. Like you mentioned, male role models. So when I talked to Chris Williamson, we talked a lot about male role models, and he talked about how he's not given any. He challenged someone to come up with a male role model, and the guy said, "My brother-in-law," and he was like, "Well, how about someone we actually know?"
Yeah.
And there aren't any. There aren't any strong masculine role models for men. Very, very few. And it's funny because I got a call out for that. And then one guy on Instagram was like, "Well, I got loads of role models." The first one was Dwayne Johnson. And I'm like, well, he's like a 6'3" Samoan or ex professional wrestler, not particularly relatable. And then he said David Attenborough. And I was just like, David Attenborough is a national hero. I love David Attenborough, but he is not a role model to men. He's a role model to everyone, but he is not a masculine role model. Plus, he's like 95 years old. I'm like, just give us a young male role model who's traditionally masculine, whatever way you think that is, and just that where who is that? Who is that person? Because it ain't David Attenborough. Sorry, David, it isn't. And I feel like if we honestly ask ourselves who are the positive male role models right now, I don't think there are many names you could give me. To be honest, certainly not enough. And it's a very real. Again, that just adds to the problem. The fatherlessness, no teachers in schools, no male role models, propaganda in the media about toxic masculinity, and it all adds to the same problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely with role models, because I'm a writer and I used to write and perform poetry as well. And some of my
Mm,
heroes came from that. So people like
mm,
Bukowski, for instance, who
mm,
totally opposite to me, because he was a hard drinking and hard smoking, and I'm teetotal
mm,
and I don't smoke. But I could appreciate his masculinity.
mm.
Whereas, and this is actually gets onto a question I just thought of, which is, do you think part of the problem now is anyone that even tries to display that as a role model, even from the past, oh, just going to media get cancelled, they're going to be criticised, and then you're not going to hear from them again, or their influence is going to be limited.
Yeah. I feel like celebrating men for what have made men traditionally masculine is just unpopular now. Um, and the ironic thing is, if you look at those things like confidence, being a leader, being sort of assertive, being in a way aggressive, competitive, like a boss, those are all things we don't appreciate in men, but we do like them in women, like a fierce woman, an independent woman, a courageous woman, a boss. And like those are all admirable, typically masculine traits that we love in women. But when a man is a boss and a fierce leader, we're like, oh, gross. So there is an interesting hypocrisy there. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Like we do struggle. it is unpopular to talk about masculine men as role models, or just even put the words male role model together into a sentence. Like people wince at just saying that, and it sort of shows how far we've fallen. That 50% of the population are vilified for just asking for a positive male role model, at least to compensate. And like there's so much negativity around men, so much toxic masculinity, patriarchy, male violence, male fragility, male privilege, man spreading, man interruption. It's like all this nonsense, and there's very little counterbalancing it, very little at all. And it is a big problem. People want to bury their head in the sand and deny it, but a lot of people are seeing it now, and Andrew Tate is sort of a walking, talking example of the problem itself, as we mentioned.
What you've been saying seems to have been ramped up over the last few years. However, before that, I think there seemed to be a drip effect. To give you an example, I'm someone who's just very chivalrous, like I'll open doors. You know, that's just me generally. Remember about 10 years ago, I was doing a degree at Open University, but we had to go to Bath University to do a study. And I was opening doors to like when female students were like walking past us nastily. And a couple of them were really nasty to me and saying, "Oh, it's internalized misogyny and all this stuff. Why you're doing?" I'm like, "No, I'm just being nice," and so on and so forth. And what I was going to ask you is, do you think, yes, it's been ramped up the last few years, but do you think there's been this almost drip effect of, oh, men are doing this and it's bad, when men are just being men and being nice, but it seems to be, like I say, toxic masculinity seems to be a drip effect over the last, well, until the last few years?
Like, yeah, I feel like things are changing. People are more willing to talk about certain. Male suicide is an increasingly popular subject to talk about, and thank God, about time. Boys in education, for example, is becoming more mainstream. Like people don't know it that well, but boys are behind in education at pretty much every stage in every single Western country. Massive problem. People are talking about that more. Mental health, obviously, a big issue for men, and I imagine every man you've ever met will have a similar story about a frustration about trying to do something good, like even the little thing like opening a door and then having it sort of thrown in your face. And I always think chivalry is very interesting because everyone thinks chivalry is like a sign of uh, internalized misogyny or whatever nonsense you mentioned. But in anything, it's almost like you're serving that person. You're opening doors, you're pulling out seats, you're paying the bill. Like the power dynamic is more complex than internalized misogyny. And I don't know if there were another group of people in society that were opening doors and putting out tables and paying bills and doing everything for another person, a bit like a servant would. I think we might have different wording to describe that relationship. But because it's men, no, it has to be bad. It has to be some sort of misogyny somehow. Like having someone show an act of kindness to you is misogynistic. So to answer your question, yeah, there is a critical mass. We're arriving to a critical mass now where things are changing for the better for men and boys. What we're talking about now, I hope won't be that relevant in 5 or 10 years time. But I think a lot of men and boys have their own experiences that they're connecting the dots, and they're like, actually, my lived experience doesn't quite line up with what I'm being told. And actually, it is hard to be a man sometimes, or a boy. And it isn't just a privilege every single day through and through. There are real problems, and we need to talk about them, and they're not being spoken about. And more men are waking up to that. People, spaces like mine, Chris, yours are growing and becoming more and more important and valued. And it's great. It's a good sign.
Yeah. Can you explain in relation to that? Can you explain who Nora Vincent is?
Nora Vincent. Okay. Nora Vincent was a gay journalist, so a lesbian woman, and she decided to conduct an experiment where she lived as a man for 2 years. No, well, I think it was originally 2 years, but she stopped at 18 months because she had a mental breakdown basically and had to go into psychiatric care. And she had her eyes opened, and she was just saying women have no idea what it's like to be a man. And if for a full understanding of Nora Vincent, you need to read a book or just watch some great videos on YouTube about her. And she had, I guess that, yeah, like I said, like the headline is women don't understand what it's like to be a man, and I imagine men don't understand what it's like to be a woman either. But even having lived as a man just for 18 months, she was like, I've had enough. It's lonely, it's depressing. There's no physical intimacy, there's no sense of love or care, either from male peers or from society. And she couldn't do it. She stopped. She went to psychiatric care, and it's tragic actually, but I think it was last year she actually killed herself.
Yeah.
Went to Switzerland and basically voluntarily killed herself by like a medical injection. But I do want to point out a lot of people have been politicizing Nora Vincent's death, and a tragic death, as some sort of dog whistle to be like, well, look how hard it is to be a man. And the reason she killed herself wasn't because she found it hard to be a man. She just struggled with gender dysphoria as a result of pretending to be someone else. And she talked about it quite openly, like it wasn't necessarily being a man that was hard, although that was hard. It was more about just um, reconciling two genders at the same time and pretending to be a gender that she wasn't. That's what really did the damage, and that's what ultimately led to her death. So it's frustrating to see both sides misunderstand Nora Vincent, and both sides try and weaponize her and turn her into a pawn for the gender war, because it's not like that. She certainly gave us some interesting findings about the male experience, absolutely, and she was a wonderful woman and a great journalist, but a bit more complicated than people like to present.
What do people get wrong about the gender pay gap?
I mean, in a headline, women are paid less than men. If you took the average woman and the average man, that man is getting paid more. But I guess the theme of this conversation has been there's more to it than that.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that you got to look at the reasons why men are paid more. And there are so many, there's so many. And although discrimination might play a part, it's a very small part. And the reasons why men get paid more is because they work in different jobs. They work in different jobs. They work in more dangerous jobs. They work in higher paying jobs. Uh, they're more likely to travel for work, which means more higher paying jobs. They work longer hours. They don't take paternity leave, really. Mums obviously take time off work to have children, fathers less so, if at all. And all those choices build up to a gap. And that gap is a very complicated issue to talk about. And it's certainly more complicated then because they're women. And yeah, we can talk about why do women not choose to become engineers? We can talk about why do women not work overtime? We can talk about why fathers don't take parental leave. But that is not the same as women are being discriminated against. And like I said, the biggest cause of the pay gap is parental leave. Like the big gap is between not women and men, but mothers and fathers. And that is because of women leaving work. A woman obviously has a baby, leaves work, might have a year of child leave, where she's not working, no promotions, no salary really. And the dad has 2 weeks. So my sister had a baby, year off. My brother-in-law, 2 weeks off. He goes straight back to work, straight back to his career, pay rises, bonuses. She didn't. And then when she did go back to work, it was only part-time. So it's not fair to compare a part-time working mum with a full-time, fully employed father and expect them to get paid the same. And they shouldn't get paid the same. But that doesn't mean it's sexist to say that.
Yeah.
So I guess it's more complicated than people think. There are different types of pay gap. So that's the uncontrolled pay gap, where we're just comparing women and men in general without any controls. But if you look at the controlled pay gap, where you're taking a man and a woman, same job, same hours, same experience, same education, pay gap 99 cents to the dollar. That's in America. And that's like, it's not closed, but it's pretty far off what we currently talk about. Everyone mentions 80 cents to the dollar, but the controlled pay gap, 99 cents to the dollar. And in fact, there are some women, like Asian women, for example, that get paid more than men. Asian men get paid more than them. So like, if we really want to go for it, it would be Asian men, then Asian women, then white men. And it's just like, it's a lot more complicated in terms of who gets paid the most than just a tweet or a screen grab of an Instagram post. It's a very complicated matter that people don't want to engage with properly, at least.
So with parental leave, wouldn't be a good idea, kind of similar to what you described, where if you say gave men and women, like male and female couples, like 18 months, and then ask them just to share it between themselves. And if that was the case, would you possibly get an equal divide, or would there actually show like a difference between how much women take and how much men take? I know it's all hypothetical, but
Well, I mean, yeah, I think you probably would see that, which is why a lot of people argue that men should have their own protected, use it or lose it parental leave. So that 6 months, say, that is the man's, and it can't be transferred. He either uses it or he doesn't have it at all. because you're all right where if there's like 18 months up for grabs, you imagine the woman's going to take more of it. And I don't think that's the right. I mean, if we want to get into details, I think women should have medical leave to actually physically recover from the act of childbirth. I don't know how long that should be. I'm not a doctor. Let's say 6 weeks. And then she gets that, he doesn't get that. And then both parents have 9 months, say. And that can't be transferred. You have to use it or it's gone. And I feel like if we did that, the pay gap would shrink substantially. And in countries, especially European Nordic countries like Iceland, especially, they have equal parental leave, and the pay gap is tiny. And that's not surprising whatsoever. But you are right in the sense that not only should fathers have equal leave to mothers, but that should be protected, so it can't be transferred. He has to take it, and or not take it. But yeah, very right.
Wasn't there a study with Uber drivers regarding the
Mm.
gender pay gap? And he basically proves our point that it's much more than just women being paid less than, well, they are, but there's much more to it.
Yeah, well, interesting thing about Uber is that it's all automated. There's really no room to be discriminated against, at least not directly. And there's so much data, like millions and millions and millions of rides, all feeding into the study, massive study. So they could basically see that women were getting paid less than male Uber drivers, which didn't really make sense because you just paid by a system. It's not like a rider can be like, I'm going to pay you 20% less because you're a woman.
Yeah.
They're paid the same. But women were being paid less. So it's like, well, what sort of behavioral changes are leading to male Uber drivers getting paid more than female Uber drivers? And they looked at the data and they were like, well, it's not discrimination. And they found 3 things. They found men more likely to take the graveyard shifts to drive late at night, and that's where if anyone's taking an Uber, you have your surge and you just get paid more because it's more demand. I think that's about 20% of the gap was that. 30% of the gap was that men were more likely to stay with Uber for longer. So women would come to become an Uber driver and quit. A man is more likely to stay with it for a longer period of time. And then obviously you benefit from having that experience, like any job. Like the longer you stay with a job, the more you're going to get paid because you get better at that job. That was about 30% of the gap. And then the biggest contributor to the Uber pay gap, 50%, was men just drive faster than women, which is like a really beautifully simple thing where like if women Uber drivers drove a little bit faster, and I don't even think they should. I personally think women in general are better drivers than men, and by better I mean safer. But the point is that it's not because they're being discriminated against. The point is that women are making choices and behaving differently to men. And again, we can talk about why are women not driving late at night. A lot of people say it's because women don't feel safe to drive late at night, which it may well be. But that doesn't mean they're being discriminated against by Uber. And it's a lot more complicated than women are paid less because they're women. In Uber drivers' case, they're paid less because they drive slower, they drive at different times, and they don't stay with the system for as long. And I guess you would find similar sort of reasons behind any pay gap, I imagine. And Uber is just a great example because it makes you think about we all act differently. And like I said, like men do work longer hours in all jobs. In general, men work longer hours than women. And it's not a controversial thing to say that if you work longer hours, you should get paid more. And is that really that hard to understand? Like, and men work more hours. So it's like, what? Like, it's not. It shouldn't be that controversial. And yeah, the Uber pay gap's really great. If you want to learn more about it, you can Google it. It's a really excellent podcast by Freakonomics about it, and they talk about it in depth. Very, very interesting, and I highly recommend your listeners checking it out.
Yes, there was because there's a similar study with Uber which found the same findings, but the one extra they found was I think men were more willing to go into dangerous areas to pick up people.
Yeah, that
As
doesn't
well.
surprise me.
Sense. And that kind of gets them onto another point, which is, and again, you mentioned this in your interview with Chris Williamson, which is how heroic men can be. That doesn't seem to be happening in the media now, in the sense of if a man does something heroic, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it just seems as though those heroic feats or anything to do good, just in like news media, isn't really being mentioned. Is that me or am I right? Or
No, I feel like if a man is mentioned in the news, you're probably going to be something bad. Like I did a post today, and it was basically asking men what are the unspoken rules of being a man. And one of the more impactful responses I got was like, nobody cares about you unless you've done something wrong. Like a man might do something excellent, no one really cares, but as soon as he does something bad, it's all over the news. And then I just think, well, really, the concept is actually called a thing called gamma bias, which is a sort of a cognitive distortion where there's a matrix of 4 different squares, and the 4 different squares indicate different areas where the male sex is either highlighted in the sense of violence or perpetration. So if a man does something wrong, like commits a crime, especially a violent crime, especially against a woman, gender is highlighted. And we have male violence, we have patriarchy, we have knife man, we have gun man, we have con man, we have, and all these very gender terms. That's one quadrant of the matrix. And then we have another quadrant where victimization directly beneath it. And that's where men are minimized. So we don't really talk about violence against men and boys, despite men and boys, especially Black boys, being the most at risk of violence. So we have a situation where the group that's most at risk to violence is being ignored. And we don't talk about violence against men and boys as a gendered issue. So that's the second quadrant. So highlighted in perpetration, minimized in victimhood. And then the other side is celebration. So we don't really highlight men in celebration either. As you mentioned, like a man might do something excellent, but it's ignored. And then the way, and then so it's ignored there, and then beneath celebration is privilege. And again, like obviously we highlight men in the area of privilege, and there certainly are privileges to being a man. There just are, but there are also disadvantages. But we highlight the male sex in the area of privilege, quite literally by saying male privilege and never talking about the disadvantages. So to conclude, the male sex is highlighted in perpetration and privilege and minimized in victimhood and celebration. And this is a really interesting angle to come at it. It's called gamma bias. You can learn more about it. It's developed by 2 psychologists called John Barry and Martin Seeger for the British Psychological Society. And it's something you can just see. You can see, like when you look at the news, especially in like a disaster, if there's like 500 people killed in an earthquake, you will probably read a headline like 500 people killed, including 50 women and children. And I read that headline all the time. You've got to ask how many times you read a headline, including women and children. And it's like, well, who are the remaining 400 people that aren't women and children? And the answer is men. And I guess if anyone wants to do any homework, try to understand gamma bias and see how the media warps our perspective of men by minimizing the good and highlighting the bad. And I promise you, you can't unsee it when you first see it. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, and I wish more people would engage in it.
Regarding how to improve conversations about masculinity, there was something again you mentioned where I think it was our 3 words you used, which was listen, act, ask. I think it was right. Can you just go into detail in terms of what you meant by that?
Oh, well, I mean, the catchphrase for men, male advocacy is like men can talk. And I know that men can talk. We're talking right now. And men are very emotionally eloquent in my experience. They're not just some sort of meat-headed caveman. They're extremely sensitive, extremely thoughtful. If you give them time and actually listen to them, which is the first word. So listen, ask, and act. So I guess what I'm challenging people, I'm like, perhaps men are talking, we're just not listening to what they've got to say, or we're not listening in the way they're expressing themselves. Ask is about obviously taking the initiative, all of us asking men, how are you doing? And there's often a wall there for men that needs to be broken through. So the first, how you doing, you probably hit that wall, and the man will be like, I'm all right, not bad. And then you're like, are you sure? And then maybe the wall comes down and he's like, well, things are hard at home, or, the wife and kids, whatever. So that's asking twice, especially. And then acting. Like people seem to think that men talking about their problems is somehow going to solve them. Going back to family court, it's like, all right, now we've got a father who's lost his child. He's talking about it, expressing himself very well. And that's a brilliant thing for him to cope with the problem. But it doesn't solve the problem. Like he'll talk and go home, and his child's not at home. His child's still gone. So acting is the final part. And acting in that sense is changing the system. Change the system. Like, don't think that the entirety of men and boys' issues is in their head to be talked away, but actually change what's going on, change the family court system, change the domestic violence industry, change how we view men and boys entirely. So I would encourage people to listen, ask, and act. as much as possible, as well as men to talk. But I guess the overall theme of what I'm trying to say is that the solution to men and boys doesn't start and stop with men. It's down to all of us as a society to listen to them, ask how they're doing, and act upon what they tell us. And I feel like that's a really, really good start.
Yeah. Do you think we also have to be humble as well? Because there seems to be a lot of people who are suddenly talking about men, but there seems to be, I don't know, a lack of humility almost sometimes, or maybe that might again
What,
just
like a lack of humility in the people that
yeah,
talk about
yes.
men?
Yeah, so there's a lack of so sometimes, and again, you talked about feminism as well. I know some people have read books and talked about it, but
Mm.
no, they just seem to be almost way off the mark, so to speak. And I sometimes think just be a bit more humble, actually listen to men,
Yeah,
actually take on board.
yeah, yeah. Again, I was talking about this today actually on Instagram. And today's post is about, like I said, what are the unwritten rules of being a man, and it's just basically asking men what is it like to be a man. And often the conversation of what is it to be a man, what makes a man a good man, what is positive masculinity, those are conversations that so often have been had by people that aren't even men. And I was just like, if you're not a man, you're sort of a guest in this space, and maybe you should like sit down, be quiet, and listen.
Mhm.
And those people that are often women that have sort of centered themselves in the discussion of men and boys are welcome and needed, but they are guests. So, like I said, sit down and be quiet and listen to what men are trying to say. So, those people like the sound of their own voice a little bit too much, and I agree with you on that. And I mean, obviously, social media is full of people that are very self-entitled and have an overinflated sense of importance, and including myself, I imagine. And I would always, I guess, I would mirror my own personal role model, Stephen Fry, his words, and he's like, make way for doubt. He always says, make way for doubt. Be open to being wrong. It's okay to be wrong. Doubt yourself. And he said, let doubt prevail. And I'm like, let doubt prevail. Start every conversation with the expectation that maybe you are wrong, maybe you're not. But there's nothing wrong with being wrong, and there's nothing wrong with expecting to be wrong. And you can only ever be right if you are first wrong. So I just wish I wish the conversation of men and boys was centered around men and boys and men and boys stories and voice. I wish the people that are not men and boys that have become centered in the conversation would take a back seat and sit down and listen. And I would just encourage everyone in the room just to tone it down, and just get over yourself a little bit. And like, we can all be wrong. We all are wrong at times. And yeah, like you said, stop. You got an overinflated self of like the egos, obviously, on social media. It's not. That's
Yeah.
not a groundbreaking revolution. There's a lot of egos on social media. That's not that's not an unsurprising thing, including me.
Yeah.
I'm not washing my hands of it. I'm not part of. I have a massive ego, and I just constantly trying to keep it in check.
Yeah, indeed. We've almost coming to the end now. It's been an absolute pleasure this conversation. Um, but you talked earlier about agency for men. Like, how could men really? Obviously, there's a lot of problems men can't solve, but in terms of themselves, how can men live a good life, in your opinion?
Just want to go back to a previous answer, maybe embellish on it a bit, and that is just to understand there's more to life than money and work and status, assets. Like, I know there's this whole crypto pro generation coming on where it's all about owning Bugattis and having crypto and having loads of money and retiring when you're in your 30s. But that is obviously important aim for some people, but it is not the beginning and end of meaning for life. And I feel like we can learn from women in that sense, that women are excellent at finding meaning elsewhere, outside of work, especially in friends and family and being a mother. And I just wish men would find more meaning in being a dad or a friend or a husband. And they've actually captured that in data, and they asked men, where do you find happiness and meaning in life? And they only had like one or two things, which is money and work. They asked women the same question, and then they had a whole ream of ways in which women find meaning. And when a person starts to lose meaning in life, that's when their life becomes meaningless, and that's when suicide becomes an option. So it doesn't surprise me that men are attempting and completing suicide at higher rates, because they just have fewer sources of meaning. So besides what I've already talked about, male suicide, I would also add that a greater sense of meaning from various different places is a very valuable thing for a lot of men to practice. And like, take your foot off the gas a little bit. Like, I realized career-wise, and I was a career animal for 10 years, and I went pretty far down that road, probably farther than most, and I'm trying to come back. I'm like, the whole success money thing is pretty good, but it's not going to give you everything you want. And I guess I'm trying to find more sources of meaning personally, and I would like other men to follow that same lesson as me, and especially women. Actually, like, women are going down the same. This is the ironic thing, is that women are trying to find more meaning in money and jobs and becoming a career woman and a boss. And I was like, that's good, but the guys have done that bit already, and I promise you, it's not going to give you what you want. So listen to what we're saying. Like, dedicating your whole life to a career is good in some ways, but it's not going to solve all your problems. And the men know that already, because we've just spent, our entire lives doing it. And I think that's an interesting lesson women can learn too. So I guess that would be my answer.
Yeah, I mean, it explains why you have rich CEOs, for instance, who are like in their 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, who could easily retire and then the money they have and live very comfortable, but they don't. I imagine it's because that work, in a sense, gives them absolute meaning and pleasure and joy.
And they've probably got a family they're neglecting, or a wife that's unhappy, or friends they don't have. Like, I talk about my dad quite often, and he is very successful. He's still alive. And I do feel like he made a lot of sacrifices to get that success that he's paying for now. And he doesn't have the same friends as I'm sure he would like. And he is a little bit lonely. So that CEO, who is a millionaire that you talked about, the hypothetical CEO, maybe he goes home to a house on his own. Maybe he's not even married. Maybe he's not got a family. Maybe he's not got any friends. And perhaps the money brings him some happiness, but the other sources of happiness that I discussed earlier could have been deprived, and he may actually be quite miserable. So, yeah.
Just quickly then, we've talked a lot about men's issues. Are there any issues around men that we haven't discussed, or not been discussed in the mainstream, that you think we should get more attention?
Yeah, all of them. I mean, all of them. I could just throw a dartboard and pick one, but the fact is that none of them are getting discussed really, apart from suicide, perhaps. But I want a deeper discussion on suicide outside the mental health crisis, and I'd also want a discussion particularly on fatherlessness and on family courts. Family courts and fatherlessness are massive problems, and they're huge, absolutely huge. Not just in the UK, in America even more so, perhaps. So, yeah, I'll pick one, but this is by no means meaning there aren't others that aren't also good suggestions. But I'd say family courts and fatherlessness are pretty important and to discuss issues.
Cool.
And if I'm going to embellish on that quickly, just the whole criminal system is biased towards men, like not just in family courts, but like criminal courts. Like, it's interesting because they've studied it as well. They've taken men and women, similar criminal records, similar offences. The men get higher sentences. Men get higher sentences and women are less likely to get a sentence at all. And if they do, men's are higher. It's like 63% higher sentence for a man. Women's twice as likely to avoid a sentence altogether. And obviously that's compounded by race, where black people are also sentenced in America to higher sentences for the same reasons. And if you're a black man, you double jackpot for you. You got the sentencing bias against men, and on top of that, you got the sentencing bias against black people. So it's like a compounded problem. So I would say the entire judicial system, including family courts and criminal courts, are biased against men, and that is a big problem. That is an actual example of systemic sexism against men that has not been talked about. So yeah, there's your answer. I'm sorry, I could keep going, because the fact is no one wants to talk about any of these issues.
Absolute pleasure to talk to you about this.
No, likewise.
Cool. Where can people find your work?
Oh, I'm mostly on Instagram, and you can find me on Instagram at TheTinMen, all one word, TheTinMen. And it's a very colourful, vibrant conversation going on. Try to post every single day, something new and unexpected and original, all sources provided, all backed up by evidence. Quite an inclusive place. A lot of women. If you come to my space and expect to see a bunch of men, angry men, you're going to be disappointed, because 1/3 of my followers are women, and they're extremely fierce too. So you can find me on Instagram, TheTinMen, and go from there.
Oh, cool. Again, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Happy to.
26 project.
Thanks, Chris. Looking forward to seeing it, and thank you.
Thank you. Take care.